I was holding Victoria Ashford's coat when I realized she had no idea who I was anymore, and in that moment, I understood that my invisibility had become the most valuable thing I owned. She handed it to me without looking, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she turned back to the women clustered near the bar. They were laughing about something, that particular laugh wealthy women use when they want everyone in the room to know they're enjoying themselves. I draped the coat over my arm and stepped back into the shadow near the coat check, watching her lean into a conversation she was clearly leading. The Ashford name still carried weight at the Laurel Ridge Club, even if most people had forgotten why. I had worked at Laurel Ridge for 6 years. If you appreciate stories about patience, about the kind of justice that arrives quietly and completely, you might want to stay through this one. What happened didn't unfold the way I expected, but it unfolded exactly the way it needed to. 6 years is a long time to be invisible. Long enough to learn the difference between being overlooked and being underestimated. I started as an events coordinator, the kind of role where you're expected to anticipate needs before they're spoken and disappear the moment they're met. I was good at it. Good enough that within 2 years, I was managing every private function, every corporate dinner, every charity gala that passed through the club's marble halls. I knew which members wanted their whiskey neat and which ones needed their failures handled discreetly. I knew how to make powerful people feel seen without ever expecting them to see me in return. That was the arrangement. I was fine with it. Victoria Ashford joined the club 4 years ago, shortly after her husband Richard's company went public. She arrived the way new money always does, a little too eager, a little too loud, performing wealth instead of wearing it. But Richard's success was real and his company, Ashford Global Solutions, had become one of the largest logistics firms in the region. That gave Victoria a seat at tables she'd spent her whole life trying to reach. I remember her first event. A spring luncheon on the terrace. She wore white, which nobody else did, and she laughed just a fraction too long at things that weren't quite jokes. But she was beautiful and she was persistent, and within 6 months she'd charmed her way into the inner circle. The kind of circle where memberships pass through generations and newcomers are tolerated only if they're useful or entertaining enough. Victoria was both. She had a way of making herself essential. She chaired committees. She hosted fundraisers at her home, a sprawling estate in Windermere Heights that she redecorated every 18 months. She knew everyone's name and everyone's business, and she leveraged both with precision. People respected her energy even if they didn't entirely respect her. I watched all of this from the margins. I arranged her tables. I coordinated her events. I made sure her preferences were noted and executed. And somewhere in that 3rd year, she stopped saying thank you. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't become cruel. She simply stopped seeing me as a person who required acknowledgement. I became part of the infrastructure, like the lighting or the floral arrangements. Functional. Forgettable. Naomi, we'll need the Rothschild room on the 16th, she told me one afternoon, not looking up from her phone. 40 guests. I'm announcing the gallery sponsorship. The 16th is already reserved, I said. The Carmichael retirement dinner. She glanced up then, just briefly. Move it. Mrs. Carmichael reserved that room 8 months ago. Victoria's expression didn't change, but something in her posture sharpened. Naomi, I don't think you understand how important this announcement is. Richard is unveiling a new wing at the museum. The mayor will be there. This isn't negotiable. I held her gaze for a moment. Then I nodded. I'll speak with Mrs. Carmichael. I'm sure you will, Victoria said, already looking back at her phone. I did speak with Mrs. Carmichael. I explained the situation as delicately as I could, and she was gracious about it, the way people of actual old wealth often are when confronted with the aggression of the new. She moved her dinner to a smaller room and never mentioned it again. But I remembered. I remembered the way Victoria had assumed compliance. The way she'd framed her need as fact and my role as obstacle removal. That was the first crack. The second came 3 months later. I had been working on the club's annual winter gala for nearly a year. It was the largest event we hosted, a black-tie evening that drew donors and board members from across the state. I had managed every detail: the venue setup, the auction lots, the seating arrangements, the entertainment. I had coordinated with caterers and florists and security teams. I had built contingency plans for weather and staffing and last-minute cancellations. 2 weeks before the event, Victoria approached me in the hallway outside the administrative offices. "Naomi, I need to talk to you about the gala." I stopped. "Of course. What do you need?" "I'd been speaking with the board," she said, folding her arms in a way that suggested she was delivering news, not asking permission. "We think the event needs a stronger narrative. Something cohesive. I've put together a vision for the evening, a theme that ties everything together. I'll be overseeing the execution." I blinked. "Overseeing? You'll still handle logistics, obviously," she said, waving a hand. "But the creative direction, the messaging, the donor experience, that needs to come from someone with a broader perspective. Someone who understands what these people respond to." I felt something tighten in my chest, but I kept my voice even. "I've been managing this event for 4 years. The feedback has always been positive." "It has," Victoria agreed. "But positive isn't transformative. We need to be transformative. Who on the board requested this?" She hesitated, just for a second. "It was a collective conversation." "It wasn't. I knew the board. I knew how decisions were made and who made them." This was Victoria positioning herself, inserting her name into something that had been running smoothly without her. "But I also knew that arguing in a hallway would accomplish nothing." "I'll need to see the updated plan," I said. "I'll send it over." She smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "I'm sure we'll make a great team." She didn't send it over. Not for 5 days. When it finally arrived, it was a 15-page document that contradicted nearly every decision I'd already finalized. New color schemes. New seating charts. A live auction format that required 3 additional staff members we didn't have. And at the bottom of the email, a single line: "Please implement by the end of week." I sat at my desk and read it twice. Then I stood up, walked to the office of Daniel Morse, the club's general manager, and knocked. "Come in." Daniel was in his mid-50s, a man who had worked his way up through hospitality management and understood both the business and the people who moved through it. He glanced up from his computer, reading my expression immediately. "What happened?" I closed the door behind me and handed him my phone with Victoria's email open. He read it in silence. Then he set the phone down and leaned back in his chair. "She sent this to you directly?" "2 hours ago." "Did she copy me?" "No." He exhaled slowly. "Naomi, you've been managing this event longer than she's been a member." "I know. And she's asking you to overhaul the entire structure a week out." "She's not asking." Daniel rubbed his temple. "What do you want to do?" It was the right question. Not what he thought I should do. What I wanted. "I want to know if the board actually requested this," I said. "I'll find out." He did. By the end of the day, I had my answer. The board had not requested anything. Victoria had pitched the idea in passing during a separate meeting, and when no one objected, she'd taken silence as endorsement. It was a classic move. Float the idea, claim consensus, execute before anyone can push back. Daniel told her the changes weren't feasible on the current timeline. She smiled and said she understood, and then she went to 3 board members individually and suggested that perhaps the club's events team wasn't as adaptable as it needed to be. I found out because one of those board members, a woman named Diane Calloway, pulled me aside at a luncheon the following week. "Naomi, I need you to know something," she said quietly. "Victoria came to me with concerns about the gala." "What kind of concerns?" "She implied that you were resistant to collaboration." That you were territorial about the event. I felt the air leave my lungs, but I kept my face neutral. What did you tell her? I told her I'd never seen you be anything but professional. Diane's expression softened. But she's persistent. And she has Richard's ear, which means she has influence. Be careful. I thanked her. I went back to my office. I sat down at my desk and stared at the wall for a long time. That was when I realized something had shifted. This wasn't about an event anymore. This was about power. Victoria had decided I occupied the space she wanted, and she was going to move me out of it, one careful mischaracterization at a time. I could have confronted her. I could have demanded a meeting, laid out the facts, defended my work. But I understood something about people like Victoria. They don't argue in good faith. They argue to win. And if I engaged emotionally, I would lose, because she had already framed me as the problem. So I didn't engage. I went back to work. I executed the gala flawlessly, the way I always did. I smiled when Victoria took credit for the evening's success in her speech. I nodded when board members congratulated her vision. I stayed late to oversee breakdown and early to handle thank you notes. And I started paying attention differently. I stopped assuming goodwill. I started documenting conversations. I kept records of emails, meeting notes, and decision timelines. Not because I was planning anything. Because I was protecting myself. 3 months later, Victoria was named co-chair of the club's expansion committee. It was a newly created role, one that gave her oversight of facility improvements and long-term strategic planning. It also gave her a voice in staffing decisions. The first thing she did was suggest the events coordinator role needed fresh energy. Daniel called me into his office on a Thursday afternoon. "They're not letting you go," he said before I could sit down. "I want you to know that first." But Victoria's pushing for a restructure. She wants to bring in an external consultant to evaluate operational efficiency. She wants someone she can control. Probably. He met my eyes. "I'm telling you this because I need you to be prepared." "I'll fight it." "But she's building support." I nodded slowly. "How long do I have?" "I don't know." I walked out of that office and I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Clarity. Not anger. Not fear. Clarity. I realized, standing in that hallway, that Victoria Ashford believed she had already won. She thought I was powerless because I was quiet. She thought my professionalism was compliance. She thought my position made me small. She was wrong. And I was done explaining that to people who had already decided not to listen. I started staying later at the office, not because I had more work, but because the building was quieter after hours and I could think without interruption. I began pulling files I hadn't looked at in years. Membership agreements. Facility contracts. The club's operational bylaws. Documents most people never read because they assumed someone else had handled the important parts. I read them all. Laurel Ridge wasn't just a social club. It was a privately held corporation with a specific governance structure, one that had been established in 1952 and amended only twice since then. The board had authority over programming and membership, but operational decisions, staffing, and vendor relationships fell under the general manager's jurisdiction. That was Daniel's domain, which meant it was also mine by extension. But there was something else. Something I'd forgotten because it had never mattered before. The club's expansion fund. It had been created decades ago as a reserve for facility improvements, seeded by a combination of membership fees and private donations. Over the years, it had grown substantial, sitting quietly in an account that required dual authorization for any withdrawal over $50,000. One signature from the board chair. One from the general manager. Victoria's expansion committee had access to proposed projects, but they couldn't move money without going through the proper channels. I sat back in my chair, staring at the budget reports from the last 3 years. She didn't know that. Or if she did, she didn't think it mattered. The following week, Victoria scheduled a presentation to the board. I wasn't invited, but Daniel was, and he told me about it afterward in his office with the door closed. She wants to renovate the East Wing, he said. Complete overhaul. New dining facilities, updated event spaces, a spa annex. How much? $2.3 million. I exhaled slowly. We don't have that. She's proposing we take it from the expansion fund and supplement with a loan. A loan. She has a bank ready. Apparently she's been in conversations for months. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Did she get approval to negotiate with a bank? Daniel shook his head. She said it was exploratory. And the board? They loved it. The renderings were beautiful. She had architects there, designers. It felt real. It's not real unless we can pay for it. I know that. You know that. He leaned forward, elbows on his desk. But she's good at this, Naomi. She makes people feel like they're part of something visionary. Half the board was ready to vote on it right there. What stopped them? I did. I said we needed a full financial review before any commitments were made. And she smiled and said, of course, that's prudent. Then she suggested we bring in an outside firm to expedite the analysis. I looked at him. Her firm. Not hers directly. But connected. A consulting group that Richard's company has used. I sat with that for a moment. She's building a pipeline. She's building something, Daniel agreed. And I don't think it's just about the renovation. He was right. Over the next month, Victoria moved carefully but consistently. She scheduled tours of the proposed renovation sites with select board members. She hosted a private dinner at her home where the architects presented updated plans. She circulated newsletters about the club's future, written in a tone that suggested the expansion was already approved, just waiting on procedural formalities. And she started asking questions about staffing. Naomi, how many people do you currently supervise? She asked me one afternoon, catching me near the main staircase. It depends on the event. Anywhere from 4 to 12. And you handle vendor relationships directly? Most of them, yes. Interesting. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering something. I've been thinking about operational scalability. If we expand, we'll need a more robust team structure. Maybe a tiered management approach. We already have that. Do we? She smiled. I mean something more formalized. An events director who oversees multiple coordinators. Someone with a strategic vision for how all the pieces fit together. I held her gaze. Someone like you? Her smile didn't falter. I'm just thinking out loud. She wasn't. 2 weeks later, I saw the job posting. It was internal, circulated only to board members and senior staff, but someone forwarded it to me anonymously. The position was titled Director of Member Experience and Events. The description outlined responsibilities that were essentially everything I already did, plus authority over budget allocation and personnel decisions. The salary was nearly double mine. Victoria's name wasn't on the posting, but her fingerprints were all over it. I printed the document and brought it to Daniel. He read it once, then again, his jaw tightening. This wasn't approved through me. Who approved it? The executive committee. Victoria convinced them it was necessary for the expansion. She's creating a position for herself. Or for someone she controls. He set the paper down. Either way, it puts you under someone else's authority. It erases me. He didn't argue. I went home that night and sat in my apartment with all the lights off, staring out at the city. I thought about the years I'd spent building something I believed mattered. I thought about the members who'd trusted me, the events I'd executed flawlessly, the crises I'd managed without fanfare. I thought about how easily all of that could be rewritten by someone with enough confidence and the right audience. And I thought about what I'd found in those files. The next morning, I made a phone call. His name was Martin Levens, and he'd been on Laurel Ridge's board for 19 years. He was old money, the kind that didn't need to announce itself, and he had a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions when things didn't add up. He also had a reputation for fairness, which was rarer than people thought. "Mr. Levens, this is Naomi Carter. I'm the events coordinator at Laurel Ridge. I was hoping I could speak with you about something sensitive." There was a pause. "Does Daniel know you're calling me?" "No. Should he?" "Eventually. But I'd like your perspective first." Another pause. Then, "Come by my office tomorrow. 2:00. I met him in a building downtown, a corner office with dark wood furniture and windows that overlooked the financial district. He was in his 70s, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that came from decades of sitting in rooms where his opinion mattered. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Sit. Tell me what this is about." I sat. And then I told him everything. I told him about the gala. About the expansion committee. About the job posting and the consulting contracts and the way Victoria had been maneuvering herself into positions of authority without going through proper channels. I didn't editorialize. I didn't frame it as personal. I just laid out the sequence of events, supported by the documents I'd brought with me. When I finished, Martin leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "You've been thorough. I don't make accusations lightly." "No, I don't imagine you do." He glanced at the papers spread across his desk. "What do you want from me?" "I want to know if the board understands what it's approving. And I want to know if the financial oversight is being handled properly." "You think it isn't?" "I think Victoria is very good at making people feel like decisions have already been made. And I think once people feel that way, they stop asking questions." Martin was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I'll look into it." "Thank you, Naomi." He met my eyes. "If what you're saying is accurate, this won't be quiet. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Victoria's smile. About the way she'd handed me her coat without looking. About the position that had been created to erase me. "Yes," I said. "I am." 3 days later, Martin requested a full financial audit of the expansion committee's proposed budget. He did it formally, through a motion at the board meeting, citing fiduciary responsibility. The motion passed, because no one could argue against financial prudence without looking reckless. Victoria was in that meeting. I wasn't, but Daniel told me she'd looked surprised for just a fraction of a second before recovering. "She asked who requested the audit," Daniel said. "What did Martin say?" "That it was standard procedure for expenditures of this size." "Did she believe him?" "No." The audit took 2 weeks. It was conducted by an independent firm with no ties to the club or to Richard's company. They reviewed every line item, every proposal, every projected cost. And when they delivered their report, it was 38 pages long. The summary was damning. The expansion budget Victoria had presented was inflated by nearly 40%. Vendor quotes had been manipulated. Timelines were unrealistic. And the consulting firm she'd recommended had a direct financial relationship with Ashford Global Solutions, a relationship she hadn't disclosed. It wasn't illegal. But it was unethical. And for an institution like Laurel Ridge, where reputation was currency, unethicality was enough. Martin called an emergency board meeting. This time, I was invited to attend. I sat in the back of the room and watched as he walked the board through the findings. His tone was calm, factual, free of accusation. He simply presented the numbers and let them speak. Victoria tried to deflect. She said the quotes were preliminary. She said the consulting firm had been recommended by multiple sources. She said the inflation was a buffer for unexpected costs. Then why wasn't it disclosed as such? Martin asked. She didn't have an answer. One of the other board members, a man named Gregory Hale, spoke up. Victoria, did you know about the relationship between the consulting firm and your husband's company? I knew they'd worked together, yes. And you didn't think that was relevant information for this board? Her expression tightened. I didn't think it mattered. The firm is reputable. That's not the point, Gregory said. The point is transparency. The room was silent. Martin glanced at me, just briefly, then back to the board. I'm recommending we table the expansion project until we can secure independent bids and a revised budget that reflects actual costs. I'm also recommending we revisit the governance protocols for committee expenditures to ensure this doesn't happen again. The motion passed unanimously. Victoria's face was composed, but I saw the tension in her shoulders as she gathered her things and left the room without speaking to anyone. I stayed until the meeting adjourned. As I walked out, Martin caught up with me in the hallway. You were right, he said quietly. I know. This isn't over. I know that too. He studied me for a moment. You're tougher than you look. I smiled faintly. People keep underestimating that. Victoria didn't speak to me for 3 weeks after the board meeting. She didn't acknowledge me in the hallways. She didn't send emails. She moved through the club as if I had ceased to exist, which was almost amusing given that invisibility had been my advantage all along. But I knew better than to mistake silence for surrender. She was regrouping. People like Victoria always did. They didn't apologize, they didn't retreat, they simply shifted strategies and came at the problem from a different angle. I'd seen it before in smaller ways, the way she'd maneuvered around obstacles rather than confronting them directly. This would be no different. I was right. It started with the director of member experience position being quietly withdrawn. No announcement, no explanation. The job posting simply disappeared from internal circulation, and when I asked Daniel about it, he said the executive committee had decided to postpone the hire pending the outcome of the expansion review. Postpone, I repeated. Not cancel. Postpone, he confirmed. So it's still on the table. Everything's still on the table, Naomi. That's how they operate. Nothing dies, it just waits. I understood what he wasn't saying. Victoria hadn't given up on the position. She'd just decided the timing was wrong. She would wait until the audit faded from memory, until the board's attention shifted to something else, and then she would bring it back in a slightly different form with a slightly different justification. Unless I made that impossible. I spent the next 2 months doing exactly what I'd always done. I coordinated events. I managed vendors. I responded to member requests with the same professionalism I'd maintained for 6 years. But I also started building something else, something Victoria wouldn't see until it was too late. I began documenting the club's operational systems in detail. Every process, every vendor relationship, every efficiency I'd developed over the years. I created manuals. I standardized procedures. I built a framework that showed exactly how much institutional knowledge I held and how difficult it would be to replace. I also started talking to the members differently. Not dramatically. Not obviously. I just made sure they understood that I was the reason their events ran smoothly. When Mrs. Carmichael thanked me for accommodating a last-minute change to her daughter's wedding reception, I smiled and said, "I'm glad I could make it work. That's what I'm here for." When Gregory Hale mentioned how seamless the quarterly investor dinner had been, I said, "I've been refining that format for 4 years now. I think we've finally got it right." Small moments. Consistent reminders that I wasn't just staff. I was the infrastructure. And then I did something I'd never done before. I asked for a performance review. Daniel looked surprised when I made the request. "You want a formal review?" "Yes." "Any particular reason?" I think it's important to have documented feedback, especially given the organizational changes being discussed. He understood immediately. You want it on record. I want clarity on record. He scheduled it for the following week. We sat in his office for 90 minutes while he walked through every aspect of my work. Member satisfaction scores, event execution metrics, budget adherence, vendor retention rates. Every category came back the same way, exemplary. He signed the review and dated it, then slid the document across the desk to me. This is one of the strongest evaluations I've ever written, he said. Thank you, Naomi. He waited until I met his eyes. What are you planning? I'm planning to make sure my value is clear. To who? To everyone who needs to know. I filed the review in my personnel folder and made 3 copies. One for my records at home. One in a safety deposit box. One with my attorney. I'd hired her the week after the audit results came back. Her name was Rebecca Ortiz, and she specialized in employment law and contract disputes. I'd explained the situation carefully, factually, without emotional inflation, and she'd listened with the kind of focus that told me she understood exactly what I was preparing for. You're not being terminated, she'd said. Not yet. Not yet. But you think it's coming. I think Victoria Ashford is patient. And I think she's vindictive. Those 2 things together make her dangerous. Rebecca nodded. Then we make sure you're protected. I'll need copies of everything. Employment contract, performance reviews, internal communications, anything that establishes your role and your value to the organization. I'd given her everything. Now, sitting in my apartment with the signed performance review in front of me, I allowed myself a moment of something that felt almost like satisfaction. Not because I'd won. Because I'd made myself difficult to erase. Victoria made her next move in early spring. I was in the middle of coordinating the annual charity auction when I received an email from someone I didn't know. Her name was Lauren Hastings, and she introduced herself as a consultant hired by the board to evaluate operational efficiency and member services. The email was polite, professional, and completely transparent in its purpose. She wanted to schedule interviews with key staff members to better understand current workflows and identify opportunities for improvement. I read it twice, then forwarded it to Rebecca. Her response came back within an hour. Don't agree to any interviews without me present. This is a documentation exercise. They're building a case for restructuring. I wrote back to Lauren and said I'd be happy to participate, but I'd need to coordinate the timing with my legal counsel to ensure I could dedicate appropriate attention to the conversation. Her response was friendly but firm. Legal counsel won't be necessary. This is an informal review, not an investigation. I replied, I appreciate the clarification. My attorney will still attend. There was no response after that. 2 days later, Daniel called me into his office. He looked tired. They're pushing back on the consultant interviews, he said. Because I asked to have my attorney present? Because they think it's adversarial. It's protective. I know that. He rubbed his eyes. But it's also a signal, Naomi. It tells them you're expecting a fight. I am expecting a fight. Victoria's been trying to eliminate my position for 8 months. And if you come in with an attorney, you make it easier for her to frame you as difficult. Uncooperative. I leaned back in my chair. What do you suggest? I suggest you do the interview. Answer honestly. Don't volunteer, but don't refuse to participate. Show them you have nothing to hide. And if they use it against me? Then we deal with that when it happens. But right now, if you refuse, you give them ammunition. I thought about that for a long time. Then I nodded. All right. I'll do it. Without the attorney? Without the attorney in the room. But I'm recording it. Daniel didn't argue. The interview took place the following Thursday in one of the club's private conference rooms. Lauren Hastings was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of polished competence that came from expensive graduate programs and consulting firm training. She smiled when I walked in and gestured to a chair across from her. "Naomi, thank you for making time." "Of course." She had a tablet in front of her and a leather portfolio filled with notes. "I want to start by saying this is really just an opportunity for me to understand how things work here. No right or wrong answers. I'm just gathering information." "I understand." "Great." She tapped the tablet. "So let's start with your role. Can you walk me through a typical day?" I did. I described the coordination work, the vendor management, the member interactions. I was specific but not excessive. I answered her questions directly and didn't elaborate beyond what was asked. She took notes, nodding occasionally. "And how much autonomy do you have in decision-making?" "It depends on the decision. For most events, I have full authority over logistics and execution. Larger budgetary decisions go through Daniel." "What about vendor selection?" "I make recommendations. Daniel approves." "Have you ever disagreed with his decisions?" "Occasionally." "Can you give me an example?" I could feel the shift in her tone, the way the questions were starting to probe for friction. "A few years ago, we had a catering vendor who was consistently late on deliveries. I recommended we switch. Daniel wanted to give them another chance. We compromised by putting them on a probationary contract." "And how did that resolve?" "They improved. We kept them." She smiled. "So the compromise worked?" "Yes." "Do you feel like your input is valued here?" It was a trap question. If I said yes, I undermined any claim of mistreatment. If I said no, I sounded resentful. I chose my words carefully. "I feel like my input is considered. Whether it's valued depends on the context and the decision-maker." "Can you elaborate?" "Some people prioritize operational expertise. Others prioritize relationships or optics. I can't control which lens someone uses when they evaluate my recommendations." Lauren wrote something down. "Have you ever felt undermined in your role?" Everyone in a collaborative environment experiences moments of disagreement. That's not what I asked. I met her eyes. "Yes. I felt undermined." "By whom?" "By people who didn't understand the scope of my responsibilities." "Can you name them?" "I'd prefer not to." She watched me for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough." The interview continued for another 40 minutes. She asked about my relationship with Daniel, my interactions with board members, my thoughts on potential organizational changes. I answered everything the same way, truthfully, but without giving her anything she could weaponize. When it was over, she thanked me and said she'd be compiling her findings over the next few weeks. I walked out of that room knowing exactly what those findings would say. 3 weeks later, the report was delivered to the board. I didn't see it, but Martin Levins did, and he called me the same day it was distributed. "Can you meet me for coffee?" We met at a place downtown, far enough from the club that we wouldn't be seen. He ordered black coffee and slid a folder across the table. "I'm not supposed to show you this." I opened it. The report was 22 pages. I scanned the executive summary first. Current staffing structures demonstrate inefficiencies in role delineation and decision-making authority. Key operational functions are concentrated in individual contributors rather than distributed across management tiers. Recommend restructuring to create scalable leadership pathways and reduce institutional dependency on single points of failure. I looked up. Single points of failure. "That's you," Martin said. "I know. They're saying you're a liability because you're too essential. They're saying I need to be replaced." He didn't deny it. The report recommends creating a senior management position with oversight of events, member services, and vendor relations. Someone who can supervise multiple coordinators and build redundancy into the system. The director position. Rebranded, but yes. And what happens to me? You'd report to whoever fills that role. Your responsibilities would be reduced. Your salary would remain the same, but your authority wouldn't. I closed the folder. They're putting me in a box. They're trying to. I sat back, letting the weight of it settle. Who's pushing this? Victoria's name isn't anywhere in the report. But her influence is all over it. And the board? Split. Half think it makes sense. Half think it's a solution looking for a problem. He paused. I'm in the second half. What happens next? They'll vote on it in 2 weeks. If it passes, they'll open the position and start interviewing. And if I apply? You could. But you won't get it. Why not? Because they're not looking for someone like you. They're looking for someone who'll do what Victoria wants. I stared out the window at the street beyond. People passing by, living lives that had nothing to do with the small, quiet war being waged inside Laurel Ridge's marble walls. Martin, I said slowly, what do you know about the club's ownership structure? He frowned. What do you mean? The club is a private corporation. Who holds the shares? The founding families, mostly. Some have been bought out over the years, but the majority are still held by the original member lines. And those shares confer voting rights? On major decisions, yes. Why? I looked at him. Because I want to know who actually controls this place. Martin studied me across the table, his expression shifting from curiosity to something sharper. Naomi, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that boards make recommendations, but shareholders make final decisions on structural changes. And I'm thinking that if Victoria's been operating under the assumption that the board's approval is enough, she might have missed something important. He set his coffee down slowly. You've been reading the bylaws. Every word. And I found something interesting. Any proposal that materially alters the club's operational structure requires not just board approval, but a 60% shareholder vote. That includes creating new senior management positions that change the reporting hierarchy. Martin leaned back, a slight smile crossing his face. I'd forgotten about that clause. Most people have. It hasn't been invoked in over a decade. Because most changes don't rise to that level. But this one does, I said. If they create this director position, it fundamentally changes how the club operates. It shifts authority away from the general manager and consolidates it under someone else. That's material. It is, Martin agreed. But invoking that clause requires someone to challenge the board's authority to make the change unilaterally. I know. He watched me carefully. You're prepared to do that? If I have to. It'll make you visible. Right now, you're the sympathetic employee being pushed out. If you challenge the board directly, you become the obstacle. Some people won't forgive that. Some people already won't forgive me for refusing to disappear quietly. I met his eyes. I'd rather be the obstacle than the casualty. Martin was quiet for a moment, then nodded. You'll need shareholder support. At least 41% to block the change. How many shareholders are there? 73. But 30 of them hold insignificant percentages. The real power is in about 20 families. Do you know them? Most of them. Would they listen to me? He considered that. They'd listen to the argument. Whether they'd act on it depends on how you frame it. Then help me frame it. We spent the next hour mapping out the shareholder landscape. Martin knew the histories, the relationships, the old alliances and older grudges. He knew who valued tradition and who valued profit, who trusted the board and who resented it. By the time we finished, I had a list of 12 names. 12 people who held enough shares collectively to block the restructuring if they voted together. It won't be easy, Martin warned. Some of these people haven't attended a shareholder meeting in years. Getting them engaged will take work. I have 2 weeks. You have less than that if you want to build consensus. Once the board announces the vote, people will start choosing sides. I gathered my things and stood. Then I'd better start now. The first person I contacted was Eleanor Whitmore. She was 81 years old and her family had been founding members of Laurel Ridge. She lived in a brownstone in the old district and rarely came to the club anymore, but she still held 8% of the shares, inherited from her father and maintained out of what she called stubborn sentiment. I called her that evening. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is Naomi Carter from Laurel Ridge. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "The events girl?" "Yes, ma'am. I remember you. You organized my grandson's rehearsal dinner 3 years ago." "I did. It was lovely. He's divorced now, but the dinner was lovely." She paused. "Why are you calling me at home, dear?" "Because I need your help with something, and I didn't think it should wait." I explained the situation carefully. The proposed restructuring, the director position, the way it would fundamentally alter the club's operations. I didn't make it about me. I made it about precedent, about the erosion of shareholder authority, about decisions being made without proper oversight. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "They're trying to push you out," she said finally. "Yes. And they're using bureaucracy to do it." "Yes. I hate that." Her voice sharpened. "I've watched this club change over the years, watched it become more about who you know than what you've built. My father believed institutions should be run by people who understand them, not by people who simply want to control them." "I agree. What do you need from me?" "I need you to vote against the restructuring. And I need you to talk to the other founding families. Remind them that shareholder approval exists for a reason." "You're asking me to go to war with the board." "I'm asking you to enforce the rules that already exist." She laughed, a dry sound. "You're smarter than you look, dear. People keep telling me that." "Good. Use it." She paused. "I'll make some calls. No promises, but I'll make some calls." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. This won't be clean." She was right. Over the next 10 days, I contacted 8 more shareholders. Some conversations went well. Others didn't. James Rothfeld, who held 6%, told me he thought the restructuring made sense and accused me of being territorial. "Nothing personal, Ms. Carter, but organizations need to evolve." Catherine Mills, who held 4%, was more sympathetic. "I've seen Victoria operate. She's ambitious, and ambition isn't always bad, but it should be transparent." "I'll vote against it." David Chen, who held 7%, was blunt. "If the board thinks this is necessary, I trust their judgment. I'm not in the business of micromanaging club operations." By the end of the week, I had commitments from 38% of the shareholders. Close, but not enough. Martin called me on a Friday evening. "Where are we?" 3 points short." "Who's left?" "The Calloway family. Diane holds 5%. "Have you talked to her?" "Not yet. I was waiting." "For what?" "For the right moment." "Naomi, you're running out of moments." "I know." I called Diane the next morning. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice cautious. "Naomi, I heard you've been making calls." "You heard correctly. People are talking. Victoria knows something's happening." I assumed she would. "She's not happy." "I didn't expect her to be." I paused. "Diane, I need to ask you something directly. Do you think this restructuring is necessary?" She hesitated. "I think the club could benefit from updated systems." "That's not what I asked." Another pause, longer this time. "No. I don't think it's necessary." I think it's political. Then vote against it. It's not that simple. It is exactly that simple. Victoria has relationships with half the board. If I oppose her openly, it affects my standing. Your standing, or your comfort? The line went quiet. I thought for a moment she might hang up. Then she said, very softly, "That's not fair." "You're right. It's not." I exhaled. "But neither is what's happening. And you know it." "What do you want from me, Naomi?" "I want you to decide whether this club operates by rules or by relationships. Because right now, it's the latter, and that won't end with me. It'll continue with every decision Victoria wants to make, every person she wants to remove, every structure she wants to control. This is about precedent." Diane was quiet for a long time. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "The vote is in 4 days." "I know when the vote is." "Diane." I said I'll think about it. She hung up. I sat on my couch staring at my phone, feeling the weight of how close this was. 38% committed. 5% undecided. If Diane voted no, we'd have enough to block it. If she abstained or voted yes, Victoria won. I didn't sleep much that weekend. Monday came. The board meeting was scheduled for Wednesday evening. I still hadn't heard from Diane. Tuesday afternoon, Daniel found me in my office. "They're moving forward with the vote," he said. "Victoria's confident it'll pass." "Has she been talking to shareholders?" "She's been talking to everyone. She's telling them this is about modernization, about positioning the club for the future. She's good at it, Naomi." "I know. Do you have the votes?" "I don't know yet." He looked at me with something that might have been admiration or concern, I couldn't tell which. "You've done more than anyone expected." "That's not enough." "Maybe not. But it matters." Wednesday arrived. I dressed carefully that morning, the way I always did for events that required composure. I went to work. I answered emails. I confirmed details for an upcoming luncheon. I did everything normally, even though my hands were shaking. At 4 o'clock, my phone rang. "Diane." "Naomi." "Yes." "I'm voting no." I closed my eyes. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. This is going to get ugly." "I know. Victoria will come after both of us." "I know that too." "Then I suppose we'd better be ready." She paused. "Good luck tonight." The shareholder meeting began at 6. It was held in the club's main ballroom, a room I'd set up hundreds of times for other people's important moments. Now it was mine. I sat in the back row and watched as the board members took their positions at the front. Victoria was there, seated near the center, her expression calm and controlled. She glanced back once, scanning the room, and her eyes landed on me for just a fraction of a second. She smiled. I didn't. Martin called the meeting to order. He reviewed the agenda, outlined the proposed restructuring, and opened the floor for discussion. 3 board members spoke in favor. They used words like efficiency and scalability and strategic alignment. They made it sound reasonable, inevitable. Then Martin said, "Before we proceed to a vote, I want to note that this proposal constitutes a material change to the club's operational structure and therefore requires shareholder approval per Article 7, Section 3 of the corporate bylaws." The room shifted. Several board members exchanged glances. Victoria's expression didn't change, but I saw her posture stiffen slightly. One of the board members, a man named Preston Clark, spoke up. "Martin, we've reviewed this extensively. The board has authority over operational decisions." "The board has authority over many things," Martin agreed. "But not structural changes that alter management hierarchy and decision-making authority. That requires a 60% shareholder vote." "This is procedural overreach," Preston said. "This is bylaw compliance," Martin replied calmly. And we have shareholders present who wish to exercise their voting rights. Eleanor Whitmore stood. At 81, she moved slowly, but when she spoke, her voice carried. I've been a shareholder of this club for 60 years. My father helped write these bylaws. And they exist precisely to prevent boards from consolidating power without member consent. I move that we proceed to a shareholder vote. Seconded, said Catherine Mills. Martin nodded. All in favor of proceeding to shareholder vote? Hands rose across the room. More than half. Victoria finally spoke. This is unnecessary theater. The restructuring is in the club's best interest. Then the shareholders will confirm that, Martin said evenly. All those in favor of the proposed restructuring? I counted the hands. 31%. All those opposed? More hands. I watched Diane raise hers, steady and deliberate. 43%. The motion failed. The room erupted in quiet conversation. Victoria stood abruptly and walked out without looking at anyone. I stayed in my seat, breathing carefully, letting the reality settle. It was over. Not the war. But this battle. I'd won. The days after the vote were strange. Quiet, but charged with something unspoken. Victoria stopped coming to the club. Not officially, not dramatically. She simply wasn't there. Her assistant cancelled her committee meetings. Her name disappeared from the event coordination emails. It was as if she'd decided that if she couldn't control Laurel Ridge, it wasn't worth her time. I knew better than to believe she was gone for good. Daniel called me into his office the following Monday. He looked lighter somehow, the tension that had been living in his shoulders for months finally released. The board met this morning, he said. Executive session. And? They've decided to table all restructuring discussions for at least a year. They're calling it a strategic pause, but what it really means is they're backing off. Because of the shareholder vote. Because you made them remember they don't have unlimited authority. He smiled slightly. You've got allies now, Naomi. Real ones. Eleanor Whitmore called me personally to say the club needs to protect its institutional knowledge. She specifically mentioned you. That was kind of her. It was strategic for her. She's making sure the board knows you're not disposable. He paused. There's something else. What? Victoria submitted her resignation from all club committees. Effective immediately. I absorbed that. She's retreating. She's regrouping, Daniel corrected. People like her don't quit. They wait for better opportunities. Then I'll be ready when she comes back. I don't think she will, he said quietly. Richard's company is expanding into the European market. I heard they're relocating to London next quarter. I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief exactly. Something closer to completion. She's leaving. She's leaving, Daniel confirmed. And between you and me, I don't think Laurel Ridge was ever the end goal for her. It was just a stepping stone. She wanted the status, the connections. When those didn't materialize the way she expected, there was no reason to stay. Except pride. Even pride has limits when you're facing shareholders who won't back down. I left his office and walked through the club, looking at it differently than I had in months. The marble floors I'd crossed thousands of times. The rooms I'd transformed for other people's celebrations. The quiet corners where I'd worked unseen, building something that mattered even when no one was watching. It still looked the same. But I felt different inside it. 2 weeks later, I received a formal letter from the board. It was signed by Martin Levens and delivered to my office in a cream-colored envelope with the club seal embossed on the back. I opened it carefully. Dear Ms. Carter. The Board of Directors wishes to formally recognize your dedicated service to Laurel Ridge and your commitment to upholding the operational standards that have defined this institution for over 70 years. In light of recent organizational discussions, the board has decided to create a new position, Senior Director of Operations and Member Services. This role will report directly to the General Manager and will hold authority over all event coordination, vendor relationships, and member experience initiatives. We would like to offer this position to you, effective immediately, with a compensation package commensurate with the expanded responsibilities. Please contact Martin Levens to discuss the details at your earliest convenience. I read it 3 times. Then I called Rebecca Ortiz. They offered you the job, she said when I explained. Yes. The one they were creating to replace you. Essentially. That's remarkable. Is it real? What do you mean? I mean, is this a genuine offer, or is this a way to control me differently? Put me in a role where I'm responsible for everything but report to people who still don't trust me. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Those are good questions. What does your instinct say? I thought about Martin. About Eleanor. About the shareholders who'd voted to protect the structure I'd defended. My instinct says this is real. But I want to make sure the contract reflects that. Then let me review it before you sign anything. We'll make sure the authority is documented and protected. No ambiguity. The contract arrived 2 days later. Rebecca spent a week negotiating the terms. By the time it came back to me, it was ironclad. Clear reporting structure. Defined decision-making authority. Salary increase of 40%. And a clause that specified any changes to my role or responsibilities required board approval and shareholder notification. I signed it on a Thursday afternoon in Martin's office. Congratulations, he said, shaking my hand. You earned this. I shouldn't have had to fight for it. No, he agreed. You shouldn't have. But you did, and you won, and that matters. Not just for you. For everyone who works here. You think this changes things? I think you changed things. This just makes it official. I started in the new role the following week. The transition was smoother than I expected, mostly because I was already doing most of the work. The difference now was that I had the title to match, and the authority to make decisions without second-guessing whether someone would undermine them later. The staff responded well. The members noticed the change in my title and some of them congratulated me, though I suspected many of them had no idea what had happened behind the scenes. That was fine. I didn't need them to know. I just needed them to trust that the club would continue operating the way it always had, professionally, seamlessly, invisibly. 3 months into the new position, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Congratulations." I almost deleted it. Then I opened it. Naomi. I heard about your promotion. Well done. I always knew you were capable of more than you showed. I hope there are no hard feelings about how things unfolded. Business is rarely personal, even when it feels that way. Best of luck in London. Victoria. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I deleted it without responding. She wanted closure. Or perhaps she wanted to rewrite the narrative, to frame what had happened as a mutual misunderstanding between professionals. Either way, I wasn't interested in giving her that. Some things didn't need to be explained. Some people didn't deserve responses. I'd learned that the hard way. That evening, I stayed late at the club, not because I had work to finish, but because I wanted to walk through the building in the quiet. I moved through the empty ballroom where the shareholder meeting had taken place. I stood in the hallway where Victoria had handed me her coat without looking. I sat in my new office, larger now, with a window that overlooked the gardens. Everything looked the same. But I had changed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just completely. I thought about the person I'd been 6 years ago, the one who believed invisibility was the price of professionalism. I thought about the months of escalation, the careful documentation, the quiet conversations that had built into something larger than I'd imagined possible. I thought about the moment I'd stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided not to listen. That had been the turning point. Not the shareholder vote. Not the contract. The moment I'd chosen silence over persuasion, strategy over emotion, clarity over hope. Justice hadn't arrived loudly. It had arrived correctly. And when it did, I no longer needed to explain myself. I turned off the lights in my office and walked out through the main entrance. The night was cool, the city quiet around me. I drove home slowly, letting the weight of the last year settle and then release. When I got to my apartment, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window, looking out at the lights scattered across the skyline. I thought about calling someone, sharing the news, celebrating in some visible way. But I didn't. Some victories were meant to be held quietly. I had built something that mattered. I had protected it when people tried to take it apart. And I had done it without losing myself in the process. That was enough. More than enough. I raised my glass to the window, to the city, to the version of myself that had fought when it would have been easier to fold. To quiet reckonings, I said softly. And then I drank. The story could have ended there. Perhaps it should have. But life doesn't organize itself into neat conclusions, and neither did mine. 6 months after Victoria left, I received a call from Richard Ashford's attorney. They were liquidating some of their American assets as part of the relocation, and among those assets were Richard's shares in Laurel Ridge. 3%. Not a controlling stake, but significant enough to matter in close votes. The attorney asked if I knew anyone who might be interested in purchasing them. I said I'd think about it. Then I called my bank. The shares cost more than I'd ever spent on anything in my life. But I had the salary now. I had the credibility. And I had learned something important about power. It wasn't about visibility. It wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about being present when decisions were made. I bought the shares. 3% didn't make me a major player. But it made me a shareholder. It gave me a seat at a different table, one where I could protect not just my position, but the institution itself. Eleanor Whitmore called me the day the transfer went through. "I heard you bought the Ashford shares," she said. "I did." "Smart girl. I learned from smart people." She laughed. "You're going to do well here, Naomi." "Better than well." "I hope so. I know so. And when I'm gone, I want you to remember something." "What's that?" Institutions don't survive because of the people who demand control. They survive because of the people who understand stewardship. You understand that. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. I won't. Good. She hung up, and I sat with those words for a long time. Stewardship. Not ownership. Not dominance. Stewardship. I could live with that. Years from now, someone might ask me how I went from events coordinator to senior director to shareholder. They might ask what it felt like to be underestimated and then prove everyone wrong. And I'll tell them the truth. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like work. Hard, quiet, relentless work. The kind that doesn't announce itself but builds slowly, layer by layer, until one day you look up and realize you're standing on something solid. I'll tell them that justice doesn't always arrive the way you expect. Sometimes it doesn't arrive at all. But when it does, when you've done the work and held your ground and refused to disappear quietly, it feels less like triumph and more like breathing. Like finally, after holding your breath for years, you can exhale. I'll tell them that power isn't loud. It's patient. And I'll tell them that the most dangerous person in any room is the one nobody's paying attention to. Because that person is watching. Learning. Waiting. And when the moment comes, they'll be ready. I was ready. And in the end, that made all the difference. If you've ever felt invisible in a place where you gave everything, or been underestimated by someone who should have seen your worth, I hope Naomi's story reminded you of something important. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes, it's strategy. And patience isn't passive. It's power waiting for the right moment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to stand your ground quietly, or watch someone underestimate you until it was too late? Share your story in the comments. You're not alone in this. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you'd like more true stories about family conflict, betrayal, and the kind of justice that arrives without noise, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every story here carries a lesson worth remembering. Take care of yourself. And remember, your worth doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be true. Until next time.